The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Kensington Palace, casting long shadows across the marble floors as Charlotte Windsor made her way through the familiar corridors. At 24, she had grown accustomed to the weight of royal duties, but today felt different. There was an unusual tension in the air that made her silk dress cling uncomfortably to her skin despite the cool October weather. Charlotte paused at the ornate mirror in the hallway, adjusting the simple pearl necklace that had belonged to her grandmother. Her reflection showed a young woman with determined eyes and the kind of poise that came from years of public appearances, yet something flickered beneath the surface. She had always been the more rebellious of the royal siblings, the one who questioned protocols and pushed boundaries, much to her parents' concern. The palace staff moved with their usual efficiency around her, but Charlotte noticed the subtle differences. The security guards positioned themselves more strategically than usual, their eyes scanning the surroundings with heightened awareness. Even Mrs. Patterson, the head housekeeper who had worked at the palace for 30 years, seemed nervous as she supervised the morning cleaning routine. Detective Inspector James Morrison had been assigned to Charlotte's protection detail 6 months earlier, replacing the previous guard who had retired after 2 decades of service. At 32, Morrison brought a fresh perspective to royal security, having worked extensively with international protection services before joining the Metropolitan Police's Specialist Operations Unit. His approach was methodical and thorough, qualities that initially irritated Charlotte but had gradually earned her grudging respect. Morrison stood near the entrance to the morning room, his trained eyes constantly moving, cataloging every person who entered or left the area. He wore the standard dark suit of palace security, but there was something about his bearing that suggested he had seen action beyond the comfortable confines of royal residences. Charlotte had learned through casual conversation that he had served in Afghanistan before joining the police force, an experience that gave him an edge her previous guards had lacked. The morning briefing with Charlotte's private secretary, Eleanor Hartley, proceeded as usual. They discussed her schedule for the day, which included a visit to a children's hospital in South London, followed by a reception for military veterans at the Officers' Club. Charlotte listened with half her attention while observing the increased security measures she had noticed throughout the morning. Eleanor, an efficient woman in her 40s who had managed royal schedules for over a decade, spread several documents across the polished oak table. She had an uncanny ability to anticipate problems before they arose and had saved the royal family from numerous potential embarrassments through her meticulous planning. Today, however, even Eleanor seemed slightly on edge. Charlotte's phone buzzed with a text from her brother William, asking if she had heard anything unusual about security protocols being updated. She frowned, typing back that she had noticed increased vigilance but hadn't been officially informed of any changes. The exchange made her realize that whatever was happening was significant enough to affect multiple members of the royal family. The first real indication that something was seriously wrong came during her morning tea. Charlotte was reviewing notes for her hospital visit when Morrison appeared at her elbow, his expression grave. He leaned down to speak quietly in her ear, his voice carrying the kind of controlled urgency that made her stomach tighten with apprehension. Intelligence services had intercepted communications suggesting a credible threat against the royal family, specifically targeting events scheduled for that day. The nature of the threat remained unclear, but it was serious enough that the highest levels of government had been alerted. Charlotte's immediate reaction was frustration rather than fear. She had dealt with security concerns before, and they usually resulted in canceled engagements and disappointed public appearances. Morrison explained that the threat appeared to be coordinated, possibly involving multiple individuals with detailed knowledge of royal schedules and security procedures. This wasn't the usual crank call or vague online threat that palace security dealt with regularly. The intelligence suggested careful planning and access to information that should have been highly restricted. Charlotte set down her teacup with deliberate calm, though her mind was racing. She had always known that being born into the royal family meant accepting certain risks, but she had never experienced anything quite like this. The theoretical dangers she had been trained to handle were becoming uncomfortably real. The decision was made to cancel her public engagements immediately. Charlotte argued against this, pointing out that giving in to threats would only encourage more of them. But Morrison was adamant. His responsibility was her safety, not her public relations, and he would not compromise on security protocols regardless of her preferences. As they spoke, Charlotte became aware of increased activity throughout the palace. Additional security personnel were arriving, and she could see vehicles positioning themselves around the building's perimeter. The usually serene atmosphere of the royal residence was transforming into something that reminded her of the military bases she had visited during official duties. Eleanor began the complex process of canceling Charlotte's appointments, a task that involved coordinating with multiple organizations, security services, and media representatives. Each cancellation required careful explanation to avoid creating public panic while ensuring that all parties understood the seriousness of the situation. The hospital visit, in particular, was problematic since children had been preparing for weeks to meet Charlotte. Morrison received regular updates through his secure communication device, each message adding new layers of complexity to the situation. The threat assessment continued to evolve, with intelligence services working to identify the source and specific nature of the danger. What had initially seemed like a straightforward security concern was revealing itself to be something far more sophisticated and troubling. Charlotte found herself confined to the secure areas of the palace, a restriction that chafed against her independent nature. She had always prided herself on maintaining a relatively normal life despite her royal status, and being suddenly treated as a target requiring maximum protection was both frightening and infuriating. The morning progressed with an atmosphere of controlled tension. Palace staff continued their duties, but with obvious awareness that something unusual was happening. Charlotte noticed how Morrison coordinated with other security personnel, his military training evident in the way he processed information and made rapid decisions about her safety. Around midday, the situation escalated further when additional intelligence suggested that the threat might extend beyond Charlotte to other royal family members. This revelation transformed what had seemed like a specific targeting into something approaching a comprehensive assault on the monarchy itself. The implications were staggering, suggesting a level of organization and intent that went far beyond typical security concerns. Charlotte realized that her frustration with canceled appointments was trivial compared to the broader implications of what they were facing. If the intelligence was accurate, someone was mounting a coordinated attack against the very institution she represented. The weight of this responsibility, combined with her personal vulnerability, created a complex emotional response she struggled to process. Morrison's demeanor remained professionally calm, but Charlotte could see the intensity with which he approached each new piece of information. His background in military operations was proving invaluable as he adapted standard palace security protocols to address an unprecedented situation. She found herself grateful for his presence, even as she resented the restrictions he was imposing on her movements. The secure communication systems that connected the palace to government and intelligence services buzzed with constant activity. Charlotte caught fragments of conversations that suggested the threat was being taken at the highest levels of government, with resources being mobilized that were typically reserved for national emergencies. As the afternoon approached, Charlotte stood at the window of her private study, looking out at the normally peaceful palace gardens. The scene below had been transformed by the discreet but unmistakable presence of additional security measures. Vehicles that weren't usually there, personnel positioned at strategic points, and an overall sense of heightened readiness that made the familiar surroundings feel foreign and threatening. Morrison appeared beside her, following her gaze out the window. He explained that the security perimeter had been expanded and that specialized units were now involved in her protection. What had begun as a routine day was becoming something that would test every aspect of the security systems designed to protect the royal family. Charlotte turned to face him, seeing in his expression the seriousness of their situation. She realized that her safety now depended entirely on his expertise and judgment, a dependency that was both reassuring and unsettling. The comfortable predictability of royal life had been shattered, replaced by a reality where every decision could have life or death consequences. The first part of Charlotte's ordeal was drawing to a close, but both she and Morrison knew that the real challenges lay ahead. The intelligence continued to suggest an active and sophisticated threat, one that would require all their resources and resolve to counter effectively. What had started as an ordinary morning had become the beginning of an extraordinary test of courage, professionalism, and trust between a royal princess and the man sworn to protect her life. The afternoon brought with it a series of developments that transformed Charlotte's situation from concerning to genuinely dangerous. Morrison had established a secure command center in one of the palace's interior rooms, complete with multiple communication channels and direct links to both Scotland Yard and the intelligence services. Charlotte watched with growing apprehension as he coordinated with an expanding network of security professionals, each conversation adding new dimensions to the threat they were facing. Intelligence analysts had been working throughout the morning to trace the source of the intercepted communications, and their findings painted an increasingly disturbing picture. The threat appeared to originate from a sophisticated network with connections to both domestic extremist groups and international actors. This wasn't the work of a lone individual or even a small cell of radicals. It suggested a level of coordination and resources that posed unprecedented challenges to royal security. Charlotte found herself studying Morrison as he worked, noting the calm efficiency with which he processed each piece of new information. His military background was evident in the way he approached the crisis, treating it as a tactical problem to be solved rather than a cause for panic. She had initially resented his formal manner and strict adherence to protocols, but now she began to appreciate the professionalism that seemed so crucial to her survival. The secure phones rang constantly, bringing updates from various sources across the government and security apparatus. Charlotte learned that similar threats had been detected against other European royal families, suggesting an international scope to whatever conspiracy they were facing. This revelation elevated the situation from a domestic security concern to something approaching a coordinated assault on democratic institutions. Eleanor Hartley had remained at the palace despite the security concerns, working tirelessly to manage the fallout from Charlotte's canceled engagements while maintaining the careful balance of information that prevented public panic. Her decades of experience in royal communications proved invaluable as she crafted statements that acknowledged security concerns without revealing the true extent of the threat. Around 2 o'clock, the situation took a dramatic turn when surveillance teams detected suspicious activity near several locations associated with the royal family. A van had been observed conducting reconnaissance near Buckingham Palace, while other vehicles had been spotted near locations on Charlotte's usual routes around London. The pattern suggested active surveillance and preparation for some kind of operation. Morrison immediately implemented lockdown protocols that effectively transformed the palace into a fortress. Additional barriers were erected around the perimeter, and specialized counter-surveillance teams were deployed to identify and neutralize any ongoing reconnaissance efforts. Charlotte watched through secure monitors as her normally accessible residence became surrounded by layers of protection that seemed more appropriate for a military installation. The psychological impact of these developments was significant for Charlotte, who had spent her entire life balancing public accessibility with personal security. Seeing the familiar grounds of her home transformed into a defensive position forced her to confront the reality that someone was actively planning to harm her. The abstract concept of royal security became viscerally personal as she realized the extent of the measures required to keep her alive. Morrison briefed her on the evacuation procedures that had been prepared, including secure routes to alternative locations and the protocols that would be followed if the palace itself became unsafe. Charlotte listened with growing unease as he described scenarios that seemed more appropriate for wartime than for contemporary Britain. The elaborate emergency plans highlighted just how seriously the authorities were taking the threat against her. Intelligence services had begun tracking financial transactions and communication patterns associated with the suspected network, gradually building a picture of the resources and planning that had gone into whatever operation was being mounted against the royal family. The scope of the investigation revealed connections across multiple countries and suggested funding sources that indicated serious backing for the conspiracy. Charlotte's parents called from their official residence, their concern evident despite their attempts to maintain royal composure. The conversation was brief and carefully worded. But Charlotte could hear the worry in her mother's voice and the barely contained anger in her father's tone. The threat against their daughter was being taken as an attack on the monarchy itself, with all the resources of the state being mobilized in response. As the afternoon progressed, Morrison received word that several individuals connected to the intercepted communications had been taken into custody across London. However, rather than reducing the threat level, these arrests seemed to accelerate whatever timeline the conspirators were operating under. Additional intelligence suggested that the operation was moving into its active phase, with contingency plans being implemented to account for the law enforcement response. Charlotte found herself in the unusual position of being completely dependent on others for her safety, a situation that challenged her sense of independence and control. She had always been the most headstrong of her siblings, often bristling at the restrictions and protocols that governed royal life. Now she was forced to acknowledge that her survival depended entirely on following the directions of people like Morrison, regardless of her personal preferences. The secure command center buzzed with activity as reports came in from across the city. Police units had been discreetly positioned near key locations, while intelligence operatives worked to identify remaining members of the network. Charlotte could see from Morrison's expression that the situation was far from resolved, despite the arrests that had been made throughout the day. Around 4 o'clock, they received confirmation that the threat included specific targeting of Charlotte's usual routes and locations. The conspirators had detailed knowledge of her schedule and security procedures, suggesting either inside information or extensive surveillance over a prolonged period. This revelation forced a complete reassessment of everyone who had access to Charlotte's movements and activities. Morrison began the delicate process of investigating potential security breaches within the palace itself, a task that required suspecting people who had worked loyally for years while maintaining operational security for Charlotte's immediate protection. The possibility that someone within their trusted circle might be compromised added a layer of paranoia and uncertainty to an already complex situation. Charlotte watched as her normally stable world was systematically examined for threats and vulnerabilities. Staff members she had known for years were subjected to additional security checks, while areas of the palace she had considered completely safe were swept for surveillance devices or other security compromises. The thorough nature of these precautions highlighted the seriousness of the intelligence they had received. The afternoon briefings revealed that the conspiracy appeared to be timed to coincide with a major royal event scheduled for the following week, an occasion that would bring together multiple members of the royal family in a single location. The implications of this timing suggested that Charlotte's current situation might be only the beginning of a broader assault on the monarchy itself. Morrison coordinated with specialized units that had experience dealing with complex terrorist plots, bringing additional expertise to bear on the unique challenges of protecting a high-profile target like Charlotte. These professionals had handled similar situations in other contexts, but the combination of royal protocol and genuine security threats created unprecedented complications. Charlotte began to understand that her ordeal was likely to extend well beyond the current day, possibly affecting her life and activities for weeks or months to come. The investigation would need to identify and neutralize every aspect of the conspiracy before normal security protocols could be resumed. This realization forced her to contemplate major changes to the lifestyle and independence she had fought to maintain throughout her adult life. As evening approached, the intelligence picture continued to evolve, with new connections being discovered and additional resources being committed to the investigation. Charlotte found herself at the center of what was becoming one of the most significant security operations in recent British history, a role that was both frightening and surreal for someone who had always sought to minimize the more dramatic aspects of royal life. Morrison's team worked with clockwork precision, but Charlotte could see the strain of maintaining such intensive security operations beginning to show. The personnel involved were operating at maximum alertness for an extended period, a situation that could not be sustained indefinitely without affecting their effectiveness. She began to appreciate the enormous resources and human effort required to keep her safe under these circumstances. The secure communications revealed that similar operations were being mounted to protect other royal family members, stretching security services across multiple locations and creating complex coordination challenges. Charlotte realized that her situation was part of a much larger emergency that was testing the capabilities of Britain's entire security apparatus. As the second day of her ordeal drew to a close, Charlotte knew that the most dangerous phase of the crisis still lay ahead. The arrests had disrupted the conspiracy, but not eliminated it, and intelligence suggested that the remaining operatives might be preparing to accelerate their timeline in response to law enforcement pressure. The night ahead would test everyone's resolve and skill as they worked to prevent what could be a catastrophic attack on the royal family. Evening descended on Kensington Palace with an ominous weight that seemed to press against the reinforced windows and newly installed security barriers. Charlotte stood in her secure quarters, watching as specialized lighting systems illuminated the grounds in harsh detail, transforming the familiar gardens into an alien landscape of shadows and surveillance zones. The romantic fairy tale atmosphere she had grown up with had been replaced by something that resembled a military installation under siege. Morrison appeared at her door with news that would define the critical hours ahead. Intelligence services had identified the remaining core of the conspiracy, a group of 7 individuals who had evaded the afternoon arrests and were believed to be finalizing their assault plans. Unlike the earlier arrests, which had netted mostly peripheral figures, these remaining conspirators represented the operational leadership of the plot against the royal family. The intercepted communications revealed a chilling timeline. The remaining operatives were planning to strike that very night, taking advantage of what they perceived as disruption caused by the earlier arrests. Their plan demonstrated sophisticated understanding of security protocols and counterintelligence measures, suggesting training and resources that went far beyond typical domestic terrorism capabilities. Charlotte felt her stomach tighten as Morrison explained the specifics of what they were facing. The conspirators had detailed floor plans of the palace, knowledge of staff routines, and access to equipment that could potentially breach the security measures that had been rapidly implemented throughout the day. This wasn't a desperate last-ditch effort by cornered criminals. It was a carefully planned military-style operation that had been designed to succeed despite maximum security precautions. The Secure Command Center had been expanded to accommodate additional personnel from the Special Air Service and specialized counterterrorism units. Charlotte watched through internal monitors as these elite soldiers took positions throughout the palace complex, their presence both reassuring and terrifying. She had never imagined that her home would require protection from some of Britain's most capable military forces. Morrison's communication device crackled with constant updates from perimeter teams that had been positioned around the palace grounds. Motion sensors, thermal imaging, and advanced surveillance systems created overlapping fields of detection that should have made any approach impossible. Yet the intelligence suggested that the conspirators had planned for exactly these countermeasures. Around 9 o'clock, the first contact occurred. Perimeter teams detected movement in the wooded areas adjacent to the palace grounds, initially dismissed as wildlife until thermal signatures revealed human shapes moving in coordinated patterns. The conspirators were conducting their final reconnaissance, studying the security measures that had been implemented throughout the day in preparation for their assault. Charlotte found herself in the surreal situation of listening to radio chatter describing armed individuals moving through areas where she had played as a child. The transformation of her familiar world into a battlefield was psychologically devastating, forcing her to confront the reality that people were willing to kill her for what she represented rather than who she was as an individual. Morrison made the decision to evacuate Charlotte to the palace's secure bunker, a facility that had been constructed during World War II and updated with modern technology and life support systems. Charlotte had known of its existence, but never imagined she would need to use it. The descent into the reinforced underground chambers felt like entering a tomb, despite the sophisticated equipment and communication systems that had been installed there. The bunker's main chamber had been configured as a command center, with multiple monitors displaying feeds from throughout the palace complex and beyond. Charlotte could watch in real time as security forces prepared for what appeared to be an imminent assault. The technical sophistication of the defensive measures was impressive, but she could see from Morrison's expression that the threat they were facing was equally sophisticated. Intelligence updates continued to flow in, painting an increasingly detailed picture of the conspiracy they were confronting. The remaining operatives had military training from multiple international sources, access to advanced weapons and equipment, and detailed knowledge of both palace security and government response protocols. This combination of factors created a threat profile that exceeded anything royal security had previously encountered. Charlotte's secure phone buzzed with a carefully worded message from her father, confirming that other royal family members were also in secure locations and that the government was treating the situation as a national security emergency. The formal language couldn't disguise the personal anguish of parents whose daughter was under active threat from sophisticated adversaries. Around 10:30, the assault began in earnest. Multiple breach points around the palace perimeter were activated simultaneously, with the conspirators using explosive devices and electronic countermeasures to overcome the barriers and sensors that had been hastily installed. The coordination and timing of their attack demonstrated the kind of planning and resources that suggested state-level backing or extensive criminal networks. Charlotte watched through security monitors as the defensive battle unfolded around her home. Special forces units engaged the intruders in brief, violent encounters that played out across the grounds she had known since childhood. The contrast between the pastoral setting and the deadly combat taking place was jarring, forcing her to reconcile her sheltered existence with the brutal realities of political violence. Morrison coordinated the defensive response, while simultaneously preparing contingency plans for Charlotte's evacuation to alternative secure locations if the palace perimeter was breached. His military training was evident in the calm efficiency with which he processed tactical information and made rapid decisions under extreme pressure. Charlotte found herself grateful for his presence, even as the situation highlighted how completely her life had been placed in his hands. The battle above ground intensified as the conspirators demonstrated capabilities that exceeded initial intelligence estimates. They had counter-surveillance equipment that reduced the effectiveness of the palace's detection systems, and their weapons and tactics suggested extensive preparation for exactly this type of assault on a heavily defended position. Charlotte's secure communication system brought updates from across London, where related operations were simultaneously targeting other members of the royal family. The scope of the conspiracy was becoming clear. This was a coordinated assault designed to strike multiple targets simultaneously, overwhelming security services and creating maximum political impact through the elimination of key royal figures. Around midnight, the tide of the battle began to turn as reinforcements arrived, and the defensive advantages of the palace complex began to assert themselves. The conspirators had planned for heavy security, but the rapid mobilization of elite military units created firepower and tactical advantages they had not anticipated. One by one, the breach points were contained, and the remaining intruders were either captured or eliminated. Morrison received confirmation that the last of the conspirators had been neutralized, but the security protocols would remain in place until a complete sweep could confirm that no additional threats remained. Charlotte listened to the radio chatter describing the methodical clearing of every building and area within the palace complex, a process that would take several more hours to complete. The aftermath of the assault revealed the true sophistication of what they had faced. The conspirators had been equipped with military-grade weapons and communication systems, detailed intelligence about palace security measures, and backup plans that suggested extensive preparation over months or possibly years. The investigation would ultimately reveal connections to international criminal networks and possibly hostile foreign intelligence services. Charlotte remained in the secure bunker until dawn, when the all-clear was finally given. Emerging into the morning light, she found her home transformed by the evidence of the previous night's battle. Damaged barriers, scorch marks from explosive devices, and the debris of high-tech surveillance equipment created a sobering reminder of how close they had come to catastrophe. Morrison briefed her on the preliminary results of the investigation, which had already begun to uncover the extensive network that had planned and funded the assault. Multiple arrests across Europe suggested international connections, while financial traces pointed to funding sources that would require months of investigation to fully understand. The personal impact on Charlotte was profound and lasting. The attack had shattered her sense of security and forced her to confront the reality that her royal status made her a permanent target for various forms of political violence. Her relationship with Morrison, forged under the most extreme circumstances imaginable, had evolved from professional duty to genuine partnership based on mutual respect and shared survival. In the weeks that followed, Charlotte would need to rebuild not just her sense of personal security, but her entire approach to royal duties and public appearances. The conspiracy had demonstrated that the traditional boundaries between public service and personal safety no longer applied in an era of international terrorism and sophisticated criminal networks. The investigation continued for months, ultimately revealing a conspiracy that connected domestic extremist groups with international criminal organizations and hostile foreign intelligence services. The attack on Charlotte had been intended as the opening move in a broader campaign designed to destabilize democratic institutions across Europe through targeted violence against symbolic figures. Morrison remained as Charlotte's primary security officer, their professional relationship having evolved into something approaching genuine friendship through their shared ordeal. His expertise and judgment had been tested under the most extreme circumstances possible, creating a level of trust that would define their working relationship for years to come. Charlotte's life would never return to its previous patterns of relative normality and independence. The security measures that had saved her life became permanent features of her existence, while the knowledge that sophisticated adversaries continued to view her as a target influenced every aspect of her public and private activities. She had survived her first real test as a target of international conspiracy, but the experience had fundamentally changed both her understanding of the world and her role within it.